All right, hello everyone. So it is my privilege to introduce to you the next speaker, Christopher Domus. If you're not familiar with any of his previous research, I highly recommend catching up on some of his previous talks. You're in for a real treat. All of his research always leaves my jaw on the floor in the very best of ways. And with that, help me welcome to the stage Christopher.
All right, thanks. So today I'm going to talk about machine check exceptions, basically what happens on a computer when something goes horribly, catastrophically wrong with the hardware. So what we've got here is a computer. It's an x86 system. Most of the stuff I'm going to talk about applies to other architectures as well. And then in the upper right, you can see the terminal where it's executing some little program. It's just shuffling around some letters to show us that it's running. I want to see what happens on computers when something goes horribly and unexpectedly wrong with the hardware. And we're probably used to seeing things go like a little bit wrong. We're used to seeing seg faults or program crashes, maybe even a blue screen. But the fact of the matter is things don't go catastrophically wrong very often. And so if we want to learn more about what happens on a computer when things do go catastrophically wrong, we might have to give it a little nudge. Because if we just sit here watching it, it can probably run this program all day. It can probably run this program for 10 years with nothing really catastrophic happening to the system. So if we want to give the system a little nudge to help it along, why don't we try to rip off the heatsink while it's executing our program? And maybe we can get something to go wrong with the CPU. And maybe from that we can learn a little bit about some of the interesting things that happens with hardware when something does go catastrophically wrong. Unfortunately, it doesn't work. The program just keeps running. There's no issue at all. We don't even get an error message. It turns out that modern programs are pretty resilient and things just don't go wrong very often. The CPU probably got a proc hot signal and underclocked itself so that it could stay within its expected thermal limits. So if we really want to explore what happens when something goes horribly, horribly wrong with hardware, we're going to have to give this system a bigger nudge because just ripping off the heat sink's not going to be enough. So we can try to make it so the CPU can't run away from its problems. It can't just underclock itself, and we'll overheat it just a little bit more to watch what happens. And I've got to be careful so that I don't accidentally melt the rest of the system, but with that, we can see that the system actually shut down. Something finally went catastrophically wrong. What probably happened on the CPU side is it got a therm trip signal and shut itself down, trying to prevent permanent damage to the CPU. And it'll be fine. After it cools off, the system will start to boot back up again, no worse for wear. But what's the point? Well, it turns out that some really interesting things happen on the CPU in the microseconds right before everything comes crashing down. And to understand that a little bit better, we need to talk about interrupts and exceptions. So the idea behind interrupts on a CPU is something like this. You've got your code running on a CPU. It might do something simple like load 1 into X, load 2 into Y, and continue executing. But some other device is attached to the CPU, and that other device wants the CPU's attention. So it sends a signal over to the CPU to get its attention. The CPU knows that that device needs somebody to do something, and so the CPU is going to interrupt your program. Maybe your program was in the process of setting X to 1, and the CPU is going to stop you in the middle of that, and it's going to transfer control over to an interrupt handler to service the device that wanted the CPU's attention. So that interrupt handler might do something like write to some hardware value and then get the hardware's response, and at some point it's going to return and give control back to your program. Then your program continues executing, really none the wiser that anything happened to it to begin with. So at least that's usually how it works, but it's not always that easy. Let's say your program was just a little bit different. Let's say your program was trying to write to some piece of hardware, write out the value 200, and then get the hardware's response. But right after you write out the value 200 to that piece of hardware, an interrupt occurs, your program stops, the CPU gives control to an interrupt handler, and that interrupt handler is then going to overwrite. It's going to clobber everything you did with the value 100, sending that over to the hardware, and then try to get the hardware's response. Well, now the interrupt handler got what it wanted, so it's going to return, and your program continues executing. It tries to get the hardware's response, thinking it's going to get the response to the value 200. Really, the value 200 got wiped out by the interrupt handler, and it's going to get the wrong response, and everything comes crashing down. So it turns out that some things just shouldn't be interrupted. That's especially true with things like privilege transitions and secure environments, but there's all sorts of stuff on the CPU you really don't want to interrupt. So the solution to that is basically interrupt suppression. Keep interrupts suppressed or pending just temporarily while you can't be interrupted. So if you're writing a kernel driver for Linux, it might look something like this. You add an IRQ save and an IRQ restore just to keep certain interrupts off when you know your program can't be interrupted. Now, it turns out it's kind of hard sometimes to figure out exactly what can't be interrupted and what can be interrupted. But as long as you write all your code perfectly all the time for every possible fringe case, and there's no issues, it turns out that that makes difficulties arise. And we've seen time and time again different situations in which having an unexpected interrupt or an exception leads to privilege escalation. So for example, back in 2012, Rafal showed that if an unexpected interrupt or exception came into the kernel right at the right spot, whereas transitioning from user land to kernel space, you could get kernel privilege escalation with that. Peterson showed something similar with using a pop SS instruction to delay exceptions for just one instruction to get an exception to occur right where it shouldn't happen, and use that for privilege escalation. Google Project Zero found something similar in TDX seam loader, right when it was tearing down the secure environment, they could get an exception to come in and get privilege escalation. Others have found ways to use interrupts to leak secrets from confidential VMs. So what we see sort of time and time again here is that interrupts are kind of like this state disruptor. They mess up the normal execution of what's supposed to be happening on the system. So the solution for all of those issues, what we've done in the past, is just really heavy interrupt suppression. Like make really, really sure that no interrupts or exceptions can come in at the wrong spot. So we can use software to help us with that, microcode to help us with that. There's ways to use hardware to help us keep interrupts and exceptions away when we don't want them. So when you see different secure code, you might see something like clear the interrupt flag, clear the trap flag, clear DR7, latch NMIs, latch SMIs, mask and its signals, clear debug control, get rid of anything that could possibly cause an unexpected exception or interrupt at this sensitive spot in our code. But then that sort of raises the question of like, can we break through all of those defense mechanisms that this uninterruptible code is trying to raise? Well, it turns out that there's one interrupt that generally can't be delayed or suppressed or latched, and that's called the machine check exception. So machine checks happen when you've got unpredictable hardware failures, things like memory corruptions or cache errors or TLB failures, and they're basically caused by aging devices or signal integrity problems, even somebody holding a blowtorch to the CPU or high energy particles from the sun, all sorts of different things that can cause corruptions that lead to machine checks. What'll happen is the CPU can detect those problems and it'll generate this machine check exception. And then in turn, the machine check exception transfers control to the 18th interrupt handler in the interrupt descriptor table, which is installed by the OS. So that looks something like this. You've got a CPU, somebody holds a blowtorch to it, that causes some SRAM bit flip, which the CPU is able to detect but not fix. And so the CPU is going to assert a pin maybe called catastrophic error, and then it's going to assert a machine check signal. The machine check signal goes over to the interrupt descriptor table and looks for the 18th entry in that table to figure out how do I handle this exception. It's then going to run the code that that entry points to try to handle the machine check exception. So we got a hardware failure, we got the machine check, now the operating system has control with that handler. What does the operating system do in this case? Well, if we want to figure out, we can actually go to the Linux kernel source, we can look in Linux kernel documentation to figure out what does the operating system do when it gets a machine check exception. If you do that, you'll see all sorts of things like this. It'll tell you that MCs can be delivered at any time. It says even in a critical section where all normal interrupts are disabled, they must be handled immediately. The system's already unstable. It will cause a machine panic. The kernel will always panic. It's a bad idea to continue. There's no way out. There's no idea of what we were executing. There's no chance to recover. We must die. No need to fumble too much. Just die. So we get an idea of what the OS decides to do if it receives one of these machine check exceptions. Basically, if it can, it's going to determine the cause of the error. If it can, it's going to print out a message. But most importantly, it's going to shut down before things get worse. So why does it want to shut down? Well, it's because usually with these machine check exceptions, we know something went wrong, but we don't know quite what it was, and we have no way to fix it. And if we just keep executing, those little problems tend to snowball into much bigger problems. And the safest thing we can do is just shut down and reset before the problem gets much worse. And there's some exceptions to that on modern systems with correctable machine check exceptions, but for the most part, that's what the operating system is going to decide to do. All of this makes machine checks just entirely unique amongst all the other sources of interrupts and exceptions on a processor. They demand immediacy, they represent this unexpected critical hardware failure, and they can't be masked or deprioritized or preempted in any way. In fact, the only way to avoid handling a machine check exception is to disable it in what's called the CR4 register. You can disable the handling of those exceptions in CR4. And if you do that, what happens is if a machine check is received while the handling is disabled, the CPU resets. So if you're writing software, your options are basically you can handle machine checks immediately, or you can choose to be just reset when one of them is received. So where that leaves us is that all of our normal solutions for fixing unexpected interrupts and exceptions, they don't work with machine checks. Heavy interrupt suppression doesn't work with MCEs. These hit the CPU unexpectedly and are going to break through any of the other interrupt defenses that we have in place. So that gives us kind of a neat opportunity for exploitation. Maybe we can use this. Maybe we can build this into some sort of hammer. But we've got a challenge. Machine checks are just exceedingly rare. They're the sporadic, unpredictable hardware failures that don't normally ever happen. And to see that in action, we can actually pull up, if you're on Linux, pull up proc interrupts. And you can see all the interrupts and exceptions happening on your processor in real time. And you'll see that there's hundreds of events occurring every single second. But that highlighted line is how many machine checks we've seen. And you could watch this for years. And that highlighted line will never change on most systems if everything's running normally. You just don't get machine checks very frequently. So we've got a problem. We can't just wait years for a machine check to come in for exploitation. So maybe we could generate these things on demand. Simulations don't work. There's some tools like MCE inject that can simulate a machine check, but all they really do is call the operating system handler. They don't actually interrupt anything. So we need real physical machine check exceptions for this hammer. So a little bit of background here. Machine check registers are arranged in what they call banks, and you have different banks of machine checks devoted to different sources. So this changes a lot across different generations, but you'll see a bank of machine check registers for the L2 cache, or for the decode unit, the execution unit, floating point unit. There's so many different sources of these machine check exceptions, and you can actually dump out the banks to see how they're configured. And then there's extended banks that capture hundreds of different machine check registers across thousands of different bits. There are so many possible ways to generate these kinds of exceptions. And if we want to know, well, what do those bits represent? Well, you can dive into the Linux kernel source and get some sort of idea. You'll see that there's machine checks for things like main tag parity error, or the micro-op queue, or dispatch micro-op queue going wrong. There's machine checks after machine checks, and this just keeps going and going and going, and there's hundreds, maybe thousands of different sources of these things. And that leaves us in a tough position. Like, where do we begin with all this? Well, we've got to start somewhere. And when I was reading through the documentation on this, I saw that some platforms are reserving the 4th machine check register bank for logging errors from the North Bridge. And I thought, well, that seems interesting. The North Bridge is a little bit more configurable than some of these other things. I might not be able to change parity errors in the L2 cache, but the North Bridge has some registers I can at least write to. So we can start there, and then we can expand on this idea later. And the details here are going to vary across different generations, but it at least gives us a decent starting point. So the data sheets here, diving into the North Bridge, kind of suggested something interesting, that maybe you can generate machine checks from a master abort signal arriving from the North Bridge. So I thought this sounds great, because the master abort is something that we can actually control. A master abort signal in PCI is when you've got one PCI or PCIe device trying to talk to another, and the other one doesn't respond. What you get is a master abort. That's something we can actually control. So even just from the Linux command line, we can do this with set PCI. We can try to talk to a PCI device that we know doesn't exist, and we should get a master abort signal. But when I try this, well, we probably get a master abort, but we certainly don't get a machine check, which isn't really surprising. That would kind of defeat the purpose of machine checks if they just occurred from such benign things like this. They're supposed to be catastrophic, not just everyday things. But still, the data sheets suggest there's some way for a master abort to cause a machine check. So I dove into the North Bridge configuration on this platform, and it's hundreds of pages of documentation and not a whole lot of information. But from that, I pulled out these 24 bits. These 24 bits had descriptions in them that seemed like maybe there's something in there where that bit might control the way an exception gets delivered to the CPU. But when I went through those bits one by one, flipping those one by one in the North Bridge, I didn't get the desired behavior. A lot of those bits were causing platform hangs and resets, but nothing caused a machine check. And maybe it's combinations of those bits that need to be set, but there's just too many permutations there and just not enough information to move forward. But anytime you're kind of stuck in CPU exploitation, a good strategy is just to go in and start smashing stuff. So I built a North Bridge fuzzer for this, which will basically go in and start flipping bits in the North Bridge to see if we get the behavior we want. So you specify the bits of interest, these 24 bits. It's going to start using North Bridge configuration commands to randomly flip bits in the North Bridge. And if you get a crash or hang, that's not what you want. Reset the system and try again. If you don't, then go ahead and try to access a non-existent device in the PCI space. That should get you the master abort, and you want to see, did that master abort turn into a machine check? So you can check those machine check registers to see if anything got logged. The best part is, even if the system resets, those MCA banks are what they call sticky, which means those bits stick around after a reset. So you can check your kernel logs to see if a machine check got recorded. So that looks something like this. In the upper right there, I've got the terminal on this system. We're going to watch any messages that the kernel prints there. On the left, we're going to start flipping random bits in the north bridge to see if anything interesting happens. I had to censor out some of the specific bits that we're using here because this issue isn't actually fully patched, but I can release those details later. But if we let this run for just long enough, flipping random bits in the north bridge and trying to generate that master abort, we'll eventually see a message from the kernel appear in our console window, and then the system's going to reset because that's what the kernel wants to do when it gets a machine check exception, and we'll see the boot logs here. Now, if we dive into those boot logs in some depth, you can actually see that sure enough, the kernel received a machine check exception. We were actually able to generate one of these things entirely from software, and what the fuzzer found is two different bits in the north bridge that had to be configured a certain way. But if you do that, then we can actually get machine check exceptions from the north bridge. But we've got a problem here, namely that the MCE that we get is being delivered to the same core that started the master abort. That's a problem because it means that a core can only ever target itself with a machine check exception. We can only ever interrupt our own code this way. That's not very useful for exploitation. We've got a hammer, but we can only hit ourselves with it right now. We need some way to cause one core to be able to trigger a machine check on a different core if we want to use this for some kind of exploitation. So basically, we need a handle for our hammer. So I modified the fuzzer a bit, basically letting it look for more complex bit configurations. And still the same thing, but the just now is generate a PCI abort on one core and see if you get machine checks on any other core. And sure enough, after you let the fuzzer run a lot longer, several hours, eventually it will find some north bridge configuration that actually works for this. And if we look at the machine check that got logged, we'll see that sure enough, it's originating from core 1 and it's being delivered onto core 0. And we find that there's 3 specific bits in the north bridge that have to be set a certain way in order to cause this behavior. But we've still got an issue. The platform still resets. That's no good, but maybe we can be like a little bit more careful. Being able to send these cross-core machine checks isn't too useful for exploitation if the system just resets. So why does it reset? Well, it's not actually the machine check's fault. It's the operating system deciding that that's the best thing to do. So maybe we can hijack the CPU interrupt descriptor table and install a first-pass machine check handler here. So the way this would normally work is the CPU is going to look up in the interrupt descriptor table what the operating system wants to execute when it finds a machine check exception. But what we can do is we can install a different interrupt descriptor table first. Our hijack IDT will get control first when there's any interrupt or exceptions. And usually what I have it do is just do some pre-processing and then hand off control to the operating system. And in this case, what we'll do is we'll have that modified hijack handler is going to basically indiscriminately clear any machine check exceptions that got logged in the MCA banks before the operating system gets control. That way the OS won't reset the platform because it can't see what actually caused the MCE. And usually you want the OS to reset things in an MCE, so it's a little bit dangerous, but it's good enough for research. So collectively, the whole thing looks like this. We've got all the interrupts and exceptions triggering on our system. We never get machine checks under any normal events, but we'll go ahead and insert our hijack IDT, and now we get control first before the operating system does. We'll go ahead and poison the north bridge to reconfigure it so that it turns small errors like master aborts into big errors like machine checks. And then from core 1, we're going to try to access a device on the PCI bus that doesn't actually exist. That's going to be translated by the north bridge into a machine check exception that then gets delivered to core 0. So this is fantastic, and I think never been done before. We've got this state disruptor tool that lets us do on-demand generation of hardware machine checks entirely from software. So moving forward, we'll use this north bridge approach for machine check generation, and all those specifics are going to vary a whole lot by different platforms, but there's many, many different ways to generate these different machine checks. Remember, I'm looking at one way or one source of machine checks across hundreds of different options. So the next question is, what should we target? We've got this hammer, now we need a nail. So the current machine check approach I'm using uses ring 0 for north bridge configuration, which means if we want to target something useful for exploitation, we need to pick something that's more privileged than ring 0. So we can revisit that requirement later. There might be other interesting ways of getting around that. But for now, let's look at things that are more privileged than ring 0. Now, a lot of people think once you get to ring 0 on a system, once you get to kernel level execution, the game's over. You've got everything you need. But it turns out on modern platforms, things actually get much, much deeper than that. And there's lots of possible options here for looking at what to exploit. There's hypervisors, secure guests, there's enclaves and secure loaders. It goes on and on and on. But the target I ended up settling on was system management mode as kind of an appealing option here. Now, I almost didn't go with system management mode just because it's been done before, but it turns out SMM has lots of really interesting properties that make it a great case study for machine check exploitation. And on top of that, it's kind of a neat mode. If you're not familiar with SMM, it's been around on x86 processors for 35 some years. It runs in a mode that's invisible to the operating system, the kernel, the hypervisor. It can preempt the OS or the hypervisor. So some people call this ring -2, actually like negative rings, more privileged than these other modes of execution. It's critical to platform security and server reliability. And it's in many configurations, it actually has access to the platform firmware, so it can push malware implants down into firmware so that those can survive if an operating system reinstall or a hard drive wipe. It's just got lots of really neat properties that make it an appealing exploit target. But SMM looks something like this. Early on when your CPU is booting, it's going to start partitioning RAM or memory space into some different regions. It's going to pick out a memory space that it's going to call SMRAM, System Management RAM. It's going to track that with a register called SMBase, and it's going to drop a whole bunch of code into SMRAM. Then firmware is going to lock down that SMRAM region so that nobody else can ever see it again. Later on, after the operating system has booted, you might get some I/O device that triggers what's called a system management interrupt. That SMI is received by the CPU. Microcode is going to take over. Microcode alone can open up that SMRAM. It's going to save the CPU state. It's going to load the new SMM state. Then it's going to jump into SMRAM to begin executing the interrupt handler for the SMI that the firmware installed. It executes that interrupt handler, finally gets down to this magic resume instruction. The resume instruction, in turn, gives control back to microcode. Microcode undoes all those processes, restoring the CPU state, locking SMRAM back up, and then jumping back to whatever code got interrupted. That code then is none the wiser. It doesn't know that it ever got interrupted or that this invisible thing that it can't see was just running. So a demo of that doesn't actually look very interesting, but I think it's super neat that there's this RAM on our system that we can't actually access or see, even with ring 0 level privileges. We can figure out where that RAM is by using a certain register, reading this model-specific register. It'll tell us where that's located, but then even with a kernel module, if we try to read that physical memory, CPU is just going to say, oh, sorry, all Fs, there's nothing there, move along. So, it's a little unsettling when there's parts of our system that we can't see or get access to, especially when there's all sorts of privileged code running in there. So it's appealing to try to compromise this ring -2. So to do that, we need to recognize we've got SMM code running in this SMRAM. And if we can somehow corrupt or hijack that code, we could maybe get it to execute a malicious payload with SMM privileges to get access to that SMRAM. So in moving forward here, one thing that's critical to realize is that CPU modes have to share their resources with differently privileged modes. So ideally, if you're switching modes, if you're going from user land to kernel space, you'd love it if you could just reset the whole CPU register state and start over from scratch. That's not really feasible when there's thousands of registers. So what architects have to do is they have to really carefully select which registers they have to change on a mode switch and which they can leave the same for efficiency. And if you do that correctly, everything will work fine, but it's pretty hard to do correctly. So in looking at system management mode, I started to look at how AMD processors implemented those register changes when it enters system management mode. And if you look into the AMD specs, you can find this chart on the right that shows you exactly which registers get reset during switch to system management mode. And it'll also tell you that the processor will start suppressing all the normal interrupts, just like we talked about at the beginning of the talk, how you need to suppress interrupts to avoid unexpected disruptions. One thing in here, though, caught my attention, and that's the IDTR register there is marked as unmodified. So why does that matter? Well, IDTR points to the interrupt descriptor table, a table that tells the CPU how to dispatch different interrupts and exceptions. And leaving it unmodified on entry to SMM is kind of a curious choice in designing a secure environment, because it means that any interrupt or exception that you get that does occur in SMM is going to be delivered on an untrusted handler. And that's not just true for interrupts, that's exceptions too. Even benign exceptions, like got to divide by 0 error, go call the untrusted code to handle that. In fact, it's kind of like taking all your code and jamming it into the function main, and then wrapping main in a try except block, or a try except, and where the except block just pops a shell. Anything at all goes wrong, give control to the attacker. Well, when I brought this, well, what else? So the CPU documentation for this is actually kind of interesting, because it'll tell you that because of this design, they strongly recommend that you write all your code without any bugs in it. So I thought, well, that seems a little bit fragile, but okay. But when I brought this to the vendor's attention, the vendor really didn't want to call this a vulnerability. And I had to get these slides for all sorts of legal reviews. So we're just going to call this a feature instead, and then we'll talk about how to exploit this feature. Because there's a lot of different ways to move forward with this. Basically, again, if anything at all goes wrong, it's going to lead to privilege escalation. But then isn't it useful that we've got this machine check tool to throw machine checks at other cores and cause things to go catastrophically wrong? We've got one challenge here, though, because one thing that does get set on entry to SMM is that CR4 register. It gets cleared on entry to SMM. What that means is that handling of machine check registers is disabled, and if a machine check comes in, the system's just going to reset. So to figure out more about this, we can actually dive into the EDK2 code. So EDK2 is an open source reference implementation of the UFI firmware spec. Basically, it gives you an example of how you can implement your firmware. So it shows you, and then you know, vendors can take EDK2 and then adapt it for their processors as necessary. So it kind of lays out this approach for building a system management interrupt handler. It says this is one way to do it. So if we look at this in some more depth, we'll see a couple interesting pieces here. So one is at some point in the SMI handler, it's going to re-enable machine check exception handling in the CR4 register right there with the CR4 right. And then later on, it's going to load up a safe interrupt descriptor table value. So that gives us a couple of different attack windows inside of system management here, mode here. Attack window, the first one, we've got really for any interrupt or exception that occurs other than machine checks, you just have to make something go wrong before that LIDT instruction. The second attack window is for machine checks, and your attack window is somewhere in between the move CR4, where machine checks get enabled, and the LIDT, where a new interrupt descriptor table is loaded. So a machine check attack might look something like creating a machine check from an attacking thread outside of SMM, and make sure that machine check is received on a victim thread inside of SMM. We've got a problem with this, and that's that the SMM design has all threads enter and exit SMM simultaneously. Basically, a thread triggers an SMI through some sort of hardware event, and then the SMI signal gets sent to all the threads on the platform. And then each thread finishes what it's currently doing and then enters system management mode, and they call that thread quiescing. It basically ensures that all threads are executing system management mode at the same time, and indirectly, it prevents a non-SMM thread from attacking an SMM thread. And that's a pretty common pattern in designing privileged execution environments. So we've got a challenge. We want a victim thread that's in SMM, an attacking thread that's outside of SMM, but all threads are either in or out at the same time. Except that's not quite true. There's an observation here that threads don't technically enter SMM at exactly the same time. Each thread gets to finish the current instruction that it's working on before it gets pulled into SMM. What that means is that an attacking thread has one instruction with which to complete this whole attack. So what if something looked like this? What if on an attacking thread we began some mystery instruction? And I don't know what this looks like yet. And on a victim thread, it's going to trigger an SMI. You can do that by writing to port B2. Both threads receive the SMI. The victim thread's going to finish its instruction and then begin executing its system management mode handler, interrupt handler. So it doesn't change the IDT. The victim thread continues to execute, and eventually inside that handler, it's going to enable handling machine check exceptions with that CR4 write. Now our attack window opens, and if somehow that thread 1 is still running and now generates a machine check, it'll be received on the victim thread at exactly the right time, and the victim thread will begin executing a malicious interrupt handler for that. And at some point, the attacking thread ends, it enters SMM, and if we timed all this correctly, we got that machine check in before the victim thread reloaded its IDT to a safe value. So that's our attack window on the right, a fairly small window. And when I did some timing measurements for this, the attack window opens about 10,000 cycles after the victim thread begins entering system management mode, and the attack window is only about 100 cycles long. So the question then is, does this mystery instruction exist? It has to generate a machine check after 10,000 cycles, still be precise enough to deliver that machine check within a 100-cycle window. So I kind of think of this as like a fuse. We need some way to delay the delivery of our machine check a really, really long time. But there's a challenge here as well. We need an instruction that generates a master abort. That's how we get our machine check. But master aborts can only be generated through MMIO on the PCI space, and the architecture requires us to use this specific instruction for accessing MMIO. It has to be a move instruction into some specific register. So how long does that instruction take? It takes like 6 cycles if you hit the cache, or 250 cycles if you hit RAM, or 700 cycles if you're hitting PCI MMIO. But 700 cycles is still an order of magnitude away from how long long we need that instruction to take for the fuse instruction. So it seems like the attack won't work. But then I started thinking about this and I realized, well, maybe most MMIO accesses take 700 cycles, but they're not all the same. There's variances in the MMIO space. So I wrote a tool to look at access times for different MMIO addresses, looking for anomalies, looking for some device in the MMIO space that takes an unusually long time to access. And from this, it turns out not all MMIO reads are created equal. Normal devices on the PCIe bus were taking about 700 cycles, but some of the slowest devices on the PCI bus were like 4,000 cycles. That's getting closer to the 10,000 that we need for the fuse instruction. So I thought, could we increase this? And I looked at adding competing MMIO traffic, at underclocking the CPU or complex PCI topologies. I couldn't get this up to 10,000 cycles that we needed. It still wasn't enough, and the attack was seeming really impractical at this point. But then I realized I was doing something stupid. I was following the specification coding requirements. And that's not what you want to do in CPU exploitation. You want to violate the requirements. So when we look at what the coding requirements are saying for accessing MMIO space, they tell us that we have to follow or have to have the following form. It has to be a move instruction. It has to use the AX or AL register. That's a 4-byte, 2-byte, or 1-byte register. And then we have to access some specific address in MMIO space. It says nothing else is allowed. So normally that would look like this. We have a move instruction that's reading from a certain MMIO address into the EAX register, and that takes about 4,000 cycles. But what if we violate the specification? It turns out it works. What if we try to read into an 8-byte register instead that it says we can't read into? We can try that, and it actually takes 8,000 cycles, now twice as long. What that means is that that 8-byte access is probably being broken into 2 different 4-byte accesses, and now taking twice as long. So then, well, we're getting closer. What else can we violate? Well, the specs also say that, in addition, all such accesses are required to not to cross any naturally aligned D-word boundary. If you do that, you get undefined behavior. That sounds awesome. Let's see what kind of undefined behavior we get when we violate the alignment requirements. So this is what this would normally look like. We're aligned to a 4-byte boundary. And if we shift that over 1 byte, we're no longer aligned, but our access time goes dramatically up. We get up to 12,000 cycles. And I think this means that we're really close. So we've got an instruction that takes long enough. All we need to do then is find a high access time on the PCIe device, followed by some sort of non-existing device that's going to cause the master abort. And that master abort gets translated into the MCE. So if we set up our MMIO access like this, reading into the RAX register that's unaligned, it's actually going to break that apart into 3 separate accesses. A 4-byte access that works takes about 4,000 cycles. Another 4-byte access takes another 4,000 cycles. And then finally, it's going to spend 4,000 cycles on this last chunk before it finally realizes, hey, this device isn't even here. It raises the master abort, which gets translated into a machine check exception. A little bit of a challenge here. We don't have a lot of control over how long that instruction takes, but we need that machine check to arrive in a really, really precise window. So this is the attack that we wanted, where the mystery fuse instruction takes exactly 10,000 cycles, so the MCE arrives at the right point in the attack window, but this is what we got. We're actually taking 12,000 cycles, and we overshoot the attack window. But we can fix this pretty easily if on the thread, or the victim thread, we just delay it a little bit. And if we kind of calibrate exactly how long we delay it, we can shift that attack window down so that the MCE arrives exactly within the attack window on the victim thread. So with this, we've got the ability to deliver cross-core MCEs to victim threads during privilege transitions at very, very precise target times. We've got all the pieces to a really great tool. We just need to pick out a name for it, and I figured it's staring me right in the eyes. I built a hammer for machine checks. I built an MC hammer is the tool that we've got at our disposal now. So looking at how to use this MC hammer for processor exploitation, then the whole chain looks something like this. You've got your CPU, you've got some devices attached to the CPU, and then you've got your RAM and some MMIO space. While the system's booting, the CPU is going to, or the firmware is going to install a bunch of code into SMRAM. It's going to lock down SMRAM so that nobody else gets to touch it from now on. It's going to give control to the operating system. The operating system is going to set up its own interrupt descriptor tables. Specifically, one of those entries in the IDT is going to point to the operating system's machine check handler. What we're going to do is we're going to start an attack thread and a victim thread on the CPU. The attack thread is going to reconfigure the north bridge, basically change those 3 bits in the north bridge to poison it. So now the north bridge is going to escalate any small issue into a much bigger issue. Then the attacking thread is going to install a hijack IDT on the victim thread, basically taking over the operating system's intended code so that our code will run instead for any interrupts or exceptions that we get. Finally, both of those threads are going to start. The victim thread is going to carefully calibrate a delay loop, and you have to pick this value carefully, but the victim thread is going to enter its loop and start delaying so that it can shift down that attack window just the right amount to get the machine check to arrive at the right time. Meanwhile, The attacking thread is going to start this really, really slow MMIO access. That address gets sent over to the CPU just decodes that address, sends it to the north bridge. The north bridge checks that address, figures out what PCI device that goes to, and it starts trying to access that device. It's going to start accessing those first 4 bytes, and a long time later, the next 4, and finally, eventually, it's going to realize that, hey, that last byte doesn't even exist in here, and we'll see what happens when it gets to that point. So essentially, we've set a timer then on the PCIe device that'll come back later. Meanwhile, the victim thread is going to trigger an SMI by writing to port B2. That port goes over to the CPU. CPU figures out how to route that. An IO device triggers the SMI. That SMI signal gets handed to the victim thread and the attacking thread. Now, microcode's going to enforce that both of those threads get to finish exactly the one instruction that they're currently executing, and then they're getting sucked into system management mode. So for the victim thread, that's pretty simple. It's going to go ahead and finish up its out instruction, and then it's going to start executing system management mode. Microcode's going to unlock SMRAM only for the victim thread. Still, nobody else can see SMRAM. The victim thread's going to start executing code inside of system management mode. It'll execute and execute and execute until eventually it's going to hit that move CR4 instruction. That's going to re-enable handling of machine check exceptions inside of system management mode. And what we need now is basically our attack window is open, and we need to get that machine check into that window before the victim thread issues the LIDT instruction that's going to remove our hijack IDT. So it's going to execute on the victim. It's going to keep executing. All the while, the PCIe device is very slowly waiting to respond. And then all of a sudden, if we timed things just right, the PCIe device is going to try to access that last byte that doesn't actually exist in the PCI fabric. So it's going to send what's called an unsupported request, basically a master abort, over to the north bridge. The poisoned north bridge is going to turn that into a much more serious error, a CPU read data error, and send that over to the CPU. The CPU recognizes, hey, this is a machine check event, and it's going to give that over to core 0, even though core 1 was the one that started the whole thing. So now core 0, executing in system management mode, needs to handle this machine check exception. It's going to figure out how to do that by looking up in the interrupt descriptor table, the malicious IDT that we installed. It's going to go to the 18th entry there and start executing whatever the 18th entry points to, and that's our malicious code, which is now executing with system management mode privileges. Meanwhile, eventually, the attacking thread is going to finish up its instruction. The attacking thread will enter system management mode. We don't have any control of it at this point. It's just going to execute its normal handler. It's going to do resume. It's going to leave system management mode. The attacking thread loses access to SMRAM, but that's totally fine because our victim thread is still stuck in SMM, executing our malicious payload here. So as a demo of this whole thing in practice, we fire up the MC Hammer tool. MC Hammer is going to do a whole bunch of different stuff. It's going to install those malicious IDTs, load the machine check kernel driver. It's going to do some measurements on the north bridge to find exactly the right time fuse instruction that it needs. It's going to modify the bits in the north bridge to poison it, basically escalate master aborts to machine checks, and it's going to fire a carefully timed SMI with a machine check, and if we do that exactly right, we get code execution inside of system management mode. What I drop into system management mode here is essentially a little command and control payload so that I can talk to system management mode from the kernel and get my command and control payload to do interesting stuff for me. So what we wanted to do is we really want to get access to that SMRAM because I want to figure out exactly what is inside of that secret memory on my system. Is there anything there that I should be concerned about? So now that we've got our C2 payload running, we can actually dump out, we can copy SMRAM to a place that the kernel can read it, then we can use a regular kernel driver to read that memory. On this platform, SMRAM, they left in a whole bunch of build strings, which makes it really easy for us to see the different stuff inside of system management mode here. And it turns out there's all sorts of really interesting things. There's access to the flash on the system. There's USB drivers inside of system management mode here. If we scroll a little bit further, we'll see that system management mode can persist different UEFI variables across boots. We'll see access to what's called the lockbox in system management mode, a way for the kernel to give system management mode secrets that it wants it to save. We'll get access to the S3 resume state, which in turn can give us access to registers that we can't normally get. We can even see platform security processor interactions going on in system management mode, where SMM actually has doorbell registers for the PSP that nobody else can touch. There's all sorts of absolutely crazy capabilities tossed into system management mode, and now we've got access to all of them. So where does that leave us as far as mitigations go? Well, the facet of this that is the malicious IDT, the interrupt descriptor table, being allowed inside of system management mode, that's true on all AMD CPUs. For the machine check piece, I developed that code on pre-Zen CPUs only, but I only looked at one machine check out of hundreds of possible sources. But as far as the machine check path goes and how we can mitigate that, we can do that with a patch to EDK2, the open source version of UEFI firmware. So the EDK2 SMM code is correct, but it does assume that the IDT was made safe by microcode. So on platforms that are leaving the IDT in an untrusted state on entry to SMM, then EDK2 can be changed to basically reload the IDT a little bit sooner in execution. So I submitted a patch to EDK2 to remove the MCE vector from that. But the IDT issue still remains. The IDT is still basically set up for the situation where any problem at all that occurs before a new IDT is loaded gives control directly to an attacker. And I think that there's a lot of interesting things that we can still do there. But moving back to the machine check side, which I think is a bit more interesting than just the SMM side, machine checks turn out to be really powerful, but they've never really been explored for exploitation before. And in looking forward at what sorts of other things can we be looking at here, there's so much left to explore. There's other sources of MCEs. You know, I looked at one out of hundreds of different things out there. So we could look at other ways of generating these machine checks. There's using ECC injection to get machine checks. There's processor errata that are documented to cause machine checks. You could do row hammer bit flips in DRAM to cause machine checks from DRAM. We could look at other ways of doing asynchronous machine check exceptions. Things like the memory scrubber on ECC DRAM can cause asynchronous events being sent to the processor. We could look at other MMIO devices or doing this with no MMIO devices. The holy grail here would kind of be getting machine checks from user land. So maybe we could look at different Ring 3 processor errata that could cause machine checks, or faulty devices that we can access from user land. And I think there's a lot to explore here, and the cool part would be if you can figure out how to get machine checks from user land, then all of those vulnerabilities I talked about at the beginning, all of those get opened back up again, because machine checks can break through the defenses that those are using right now. We could look at other exploit targets like hypervisors or secure guests or enclaves or secure loaders. We could even look at other architectures, because while we looked at x86 for this presentation, most architectures have a similar idea to these hardware error events. We could look at ARM and RISC-V and MIPS and Power. So I think really we're just scratching the tip of the iceberg here, and it's exciting to see where this will go. But in wrapping up, whenever I do this kind of research, I always feel like I'm kind of standing on the shoulders of giants. So, and sometimes people want to find out how they can learn more. So I did want to give a big shout out to the Ent31 team, which was really instrumental and supportive in a lot of this early research and springboarded a lot of these ideas. I want to give a big thanks to the DazzleCat team that's always helping me come up with new ways to move forward, even when it seems like research is blocked. And if you want to learn more about the exploitation side of all of this, there's lots of great papers and prior research out there as far as how to weaponize interrupts in different situations. And then if you really want to dive in, you can start looking at the Linux kernel source and figure out how interrupts and machine checks are handled in different situations. But you know, there's lots more to come here. I've got lots of different things to do with this research, and you can find me on most platforms at XOR EAX, EAX, EAX. And I'm going to start pushing this research to GitHub as soon as I'm able to. Like I said, the issue isn't patched quite yet, so I'm going to push stuff incrementally as these issues get fixed. But stay tuned, much more to come, and thank you.